I'm afraid if we lose this one, it's going to take a civil war to save the country, and it will be saved. And if we come down to a civil war, I'm glad we got people like Schmitty and the Bikers for Trump on our side.
This is Saturn Girl, and we're talking about a very serious subject today. But if I don't make stupid jokes about it, I'll get depressed. So please pardon me for making light of some very heavy topics. Now you may be thinking, what has you so worried, Saturn Girl? Well, after watching that clip of George Lang, an Ohio State senator with a really bad comb-over, I think you know what it is. Anyone can see that we are living through a pivotal and potentially problematic point in history. Right now, as I speak, Vladimir Lenin famously said that there are decades where nothing happens. And then there are weeks where decades happen. You may have even noticed a few decades worth of news happening over the last several weeks. And things don't seem to be slowing down. In fact, they're speeding up. As political divisions sharpen, many Americans are asking themselves, could there be a second civil war? About half of Americans think it's likely within their lifetime. And that's according to a poll from this past May 2024. And given the political violence and attacks on civil rights that we've seen proliferate in recent years, the possibility of civil conflict is becoming more and more real. As I did research for this video, I noticed many striking similarities between the decade leading up to the Civil War and the past 9 years. Writing this script was like writing a college term paper. I'm talking about similarities like struggles for civil rights, culture wars, unpopular Supreme Court decisions, election interference and denial, anti-immigrant movements, pandemics, religious fundamentalism, and conspiracy theories. And I ain't gonna lie, it's a bit alarming. But of course, I'm an astrologer. So what does the astrology say? Well, you better watch this whole video and find out, because we're going to examine some of the astrological transits and historical parallels between the events leading up to the Civil War and those in very recent history. So join me, and let's see if we can divine the answer to perhaps the most pressing question in the minds of Americans right now. Will there be a second Civil War? Now let's start by going over some of the big transits coming up in 2025. It's gonna be a big year. First, Uranus enters Gemini, which happens about every 84 years. Uranus was in Gemini during the American Revolution, when the United States was born. Therefore, 2025 is the beginning of what we call the third Uranus return of the United States. The first one brought us the American Civil War, and the second one brought us the involvement of the United States in World War II. Even mainstream authors and academics have noticed this pattern. For example, in the late 90s, author Neil Howe wrote the book called The Fourth Turning, which analyzed this phenomena, but of course with no awareness of the Uranus cycle. Moreover, Neptune is entering Aries, which hasn't happened since the start of the American Civil War. In fact, Uranus will be in Gemini at the same time Neptune is in Aries, for the first time since the Battle of Fort Sumter, which kicked off the Civil War in 1861. The previous time Neptune entered Aries was 1697, which correlated with William Penn first presenting the idea of a colonial union, which was a prelude to the United States. The time before that was 1533. When King Henry VIII established the Church of England and declared himself the supreme head. This was a prelude to the rise of secular states. We also have a conjunction between Saturn and Neptune that starts next year. These Saturn-Neptune conjunctions have historically correlated with leaders articulating a vision of new systems and structures, challenging existing ones, of course, and often with misplaced idealism and accompanied by violence. For example, in 1917, the Saturn-Neptune conjunction correlated with the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, and with then-President Woodrow Wilson publishing his 14 points, which envisioned a world of global cooperation, including a League of Nations, which was a prelude to the United Nations. The conjunction in 1953 inaugurated both President Dwight D. Eisenhower and the Epic of American Imperialism, which ended the long tradition of neutrality and non-interventionism, while the one in 1989 brought the fall of the Soviet Union and the beginning of American dominance in a unipolar world. We can see that dominance waning as we approach this next conjunction. These three celestial movements are adding to my growing concern about 2025 and the subsequent 7 years. So we're going to talk about why. And this is a video about United States history. So we're going to analyze these transits in the context of what we call the Sibley chart. That is, the birth chart for the US, which was first cast by English astrologer and physician Ebenezer Sibley, using the famous date of July 4th, 1776 at 5:10 p.m. in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. So go ahead and pull it up if you want to follow along. Otherwise, sit back, relax, and pay attention. But before we get to all that, let's get something straight first. The American Civil War was about slavery. If you didn't know that, now you do. But Saturn girl, my conservative uncle told me the Civil War was about states' rights and economics. Oh yeah? A state's right to what? What was the economic system of the antebellum South? That's right! The answer to both is slavery! Boom! Done. End of discussion. In fact, slavery was the defining and dividing issue in the 1840s and 50s as the United States expanded west. Now you may be thinking, but Saturn girl, slavery isn't a political issue anymore. Well, constitutional law professor Michelle Goodwin recently wrote a book called Policing the Womb, and she highlights the similarities between slavery and the suppression of reproductive rights going on right now. Back then, the primary division was between slave states and free states. Now it's largely between red states and blue states. That is, states that tend to vote Republican and those who tend to vote Democrat. It sounds a little bit like Dr. Seuss, doesn't it? One state, two state, red state, blue state. Knick-knack, paddywhack, give this girl a bone. Anyway, Goodwin argues that both slavery and abortion have to do with bodily autonomy. That is, whether African slaves would be free to sell their own labor, and whether women would be free to decide whether they wanted children. The alternatives are forced labor, which is slavery, and forced birth, which is The Handmaid's Tale, although I haven't watched it. It's too heavy for me. I can't take that kind of thing. Therefore, the common question between the Civil War and now is whether all Americans have the right to life, liberty, and democracy. That is, civil rights. We also face an assault on transgender rights, voting rights, immigrants' rights, and we still have an ongoing genocide in Gaza. All of these issues are reminiscent of the political climate in the 1850s. For example, one of the most glaring similarities between then and now that I saw was a rogue Supreme Court making very unpopular decisions. You probably remember a couple of years ago when the Supreme Court issued the Dobbs decision, overturning Roe v. Wade, which had guaranteed a woman's right to an abortion since 1973. For 50 years, Roe v. Wade had been the law of the land, until 2022 when a court majority said, fuck what the people want and fuck women's rights. Although I doubt any of them actually know how to fuck. Now, 22 states have abortion bans or near abortion bans, and that's almost half the country. The sleepy former president and fake populist Donald John Trump made this possible by appointing 3 ultra-conservative activist judges to the United States Supreme Court. This was virtually the same thing that happened in the 1850s. Prior to 1854, the Missouri Compromise had been the law of the land since 1820. For nearly 30 years, it sought to balance the influence of slave states and free states in the federal government. It basically said that Missouri would be admitted as a slave state, but that no additional slave states would be added above a certain line called the 36th parallel. In addition, every time a slave state was admitted, the government would also have to admit a free state, and vice versa, in order to maintain the delicate balance between competing interests. However, the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 effectively repealed the Missouri Compromise, just like the Dobbs decision did. Politicians like Senator Stephen A. Douglas, President Franklin Pierce, and future President James Buchanan lobbied hard for this legislation because they wanted the Kansas and Nebraska territories to be organized into states to support the expanding railroads. They didn't want to touch the slavery question with a 10-foot pole, so proponents of this legislation said it would be settled by popular sovereignty, which basically meant that the white landowning population of a state would decide if they would permit slavery or not. They were essentially throwing the question back to the states. Doesn't that sound like Donald John Trump? Everyone wanted Roe v. Wade overturned, so we threw it back to the states. Let the states decide if they want abortion or not. But this meant that any state could come in as a slave state and upset the balance that was mandated by the Missouri Compromise. Moreover, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court at the time, Richard Taney, declared that the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional. He said the federal government could not prohibit a state from having slavery. Isn't he a charming, handsome fellow? He was a Pisces sun, too. They tend to age like beef jerky. I mean, he looks like a human Shar-Pei. Therefore, the Kansas-Nebraska Act was one of the most incendiary events leading up to the Civil War. However, Chief Justice Taney was not done being an asshole. Oh no, he would reach a whole new level of evil when he delivered the Dred Scott decision in 1857, which basically said that a slave was still a slave even in a free state. He added that black people were naturally inferior and had no rights to citizenship. Therefore, he said they had to be slaves for their own good. I have no words for that. I hope Taney is burning in hell next to Henry Kissinger. And hopefully Justices Clarence Thomas and Samuel Alito will join them very soon. It'll be a charming, handsome fellow reunion. In fact, Republicans are trying to invoke the Dred Scott decision right now in order to say that Kamala Harris can't even run for president. You can't make this shit up. But it's like a hit of dopamine to my content brain. But abolitionists in 1857 interpreted this decision to mean that there really weren't any free states, because you could apparently own slaves in them. And similar to the Dobbs decision, the justices that sided with the majority opinion were appointed by Andrew Jackson, another fake populist and apparently a Dracula impersonator. But that's another story. 7 years before the Dred Scott decision, though, Congress passed the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850. This deputized all U.S. citizens to turn in escaped slaves, even in free states. Normal citizens became secret police. All you needed was one white person to say that you're a slave, and boom, you're a slave, even if you were free. The result was a mass exodus of free black people to Canada in fear that they would lose their freedom. This should remind you of the travel bans that red states are imposing or trying to impose on anyone traveling to another state for an abortion. And, in the tradition of the Fugitive Slave Act, Texas deputized their own private citizens to turn in their neighbors if they suspect them of aiding and abetting an abortion. In both the Dobbs decision and the Kansas-Nebraska Act, transiting Mercury was in Gemini, the 7th house of the United States, and conjunct her natal Uranus. The 7th house is often known for marriages and romantic relationships, but traditionally it also has to do with opponents, competitions, and even war. Mercury rules announcements, as well as the U.S.'s 7th house of oppositions and 10th house of public life and direction. These two events further inflame the conflict festering between already contentious opponents. What's more is that Mercury was square Mars during the Kansas-Nebraska Act, while transit Mars was square natal Mercury during the Dobbs decision. The Dred Scott decision was a bit different, but transiting Mercury was exactly trine natal Mars. Since the Dobbs decision, women's healthcare providers have also been leaving red states in droves. About 7 million American women have no local access to obstetric care, and about 7% of American women received late or no prenatal care in 2022. Let me repeat that. About 7% of American women had late or no prenatal care in 2022. These red spots on the map are called maternity care deserts. In fact, the states with the most abortion restrictions have the highest mother and infant mortality rates. For example, the infant mortality rate went up 13% in Texas after the Dobbs decision. And now, the United States has the highest maternal mortality rate of any other developed nation. That means pregnant women die at higher rates in the US than in any other of the high-income countries. Reproductive rights is a life and death issue for women. And you know, trans men and non-binary people can often get pregnant too. In fact, trans people and their families have also been fleeing the growing hostility and violence against them in red states. Many of these states have taken away our civil rights, and the Supreme Court recently ruled that it's legal to discriminate against us. Apparently, you have the right to harass me because it's your free speech. Meanwhile, I have the right to remain silent and just take the abuse. Oh, I know I'm being used, but it's okay because I like the abuse. That was The Offspring. Another major parallel that I see between the 1850s and now is the anti-immigrant panic. Back then, most of the immigrants were coming from Western European countries like Ireland, Germany, and Italy. And you may or may not be surprised to learn that they weren't even considered white by the Anglo-Saxon Protestant majority in America. Of course, there's no comparison between chattel slavery, where people of African descent were forced into labor and bought and sold like property. But immigrants were still treated abominably. You see, many of them were Catholic, and the fear was that they'd be more loyal to the Pope than the US government. In fact, there was a whole anti-immigrant political party called the Know Nothing Party. And as I said earlier, immigrants were seen as racially inferior. And many Americans were afraid that they'd sully the superior gene pool and corrupt our virtuous white women. My virtue was corrupted before I could even see an R-rated movie. Now, doesn't that sound like Donald John Trump saying, "They're poisoning the blood of our country. The immigrants are poisoning the blood of our country"? Most of those same old fears are prevalent in the US right now. That immigrants will flood in across the border and change our political system in some way. In fact, Republicans frequently say that Democrats are purposefully bringing in immigrants in order to steal elections. But we'll get to conspiracy theories later. Donald John Trump has also threatened mass deportations of undocumented immigrants, which is rightfully causing a lot of fear among many in the Latino community. This also sounds reminiscent of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 and the Dred Scott decision, in that police can detain you simply for suspecting that you may be an undocumented immigrant, which really means they can arrest you for being Latino. And like free people of African descent were targeted by the fugitive slave laws of the 1850s, immigrants who have lived, worked, and raised families in the United States are similarly being targeted now. And Donald John Trump constantly repeats lies that immigrants are flooding in through open borders, smuggling in loads of fentanyl, and murdering hundreds of thousands of Americans. But we know the border isn't open. More undocumented immigrants have been arrested under the Joe Biden administration than there were under Trump. And that's not a good thing. We also know that 90% of the fentanyl coming into the United States doesn't come through illegal border crossings, rather through conventional points of entry. And we know that 90% of the people smuggling this stuff are American citizens. And according to U.S. Customs and Border Protection, only 25 undocumented immigrants have been convicted of murder this year. No, I don't mean 25%. I mean 25 individuals. So much for the hundreds of thousands, huh? The fact remains that immigrants are not taking your jobs, and they are not abusing welfare. In fact, they use government assistance programs at far lower rates than American citizens do. And they have a net zero effect on the government budget, which means they pay just as much in taxes as they consume in benefits. They also commit crimes at far lower rates than native-born American citizens. So we have to dispel these lies so we don't fall further into xenophobic idiocy. I also mentioned in the intro that we've had election rigging and denialism, both then and now. But to examine this, we have to go back to the Kansas-Nebraska nonsense around 1855, because we didn't talk about all of it. Following the Kansas-Nebraska Act, loads of pro-slavery nuts from Missouri flooded into Kansas in order to rig their elections. They wanted to set up a pro-slavery government and tried to use fear and intimidation to do it. In fact, these thugs were called border ruffians, and I predict that we'll see similar political violence around Election Day in 2024. Mars will be closely opposite Pluto then, which typically means imposing control through violence. However, by the mid-1850s, abolitionists outnumbered the pro-slavery interests by nearly a 2-to-1 margin. The ruffians knew that the only way they could force a pro-slavery constitution was through cheating and violence. Their views and policies were not only unpopular, but abhorrent. Once again, this should remind you of the Republican Party now. I mean, did you ever think we'd see voter rights suppression again? Well, it's happening right now. Many state election boards have been packed with election deniers and MAGA extremists. Voter rights groups in Georgia are suing their state election board for rules that they had passed, basically saying that they can not certify elections if they just claim that there was voter fraud, which doesn't actually happen. In Nebraska, Republicans blocked a law that had already been passed, which would have given 7,000 convicted felons who already served their time the right to vote. Talk about a major disenfranchisement. And in Texas, the state attorney general ordered raids on the homes of many Latino civil rights activists, claiming that they were somehow engaged in voter fraud, which is fucking bullshit. This is blatant voter suppression. They do this kind of thing because they know they can't win based on their policies, which are awful. And remember how I said earlier that Republicans were trying to invoke the Dred Scott decision in order to keep Kamala Harris off the ballot? Holy shit, that's major voter disenfranchisement. I was like, what the fuck? Can we just add any more parallels between the Civil War and now? This election will be more divided than that of 1860. For those of you who don't remember, that was when Abraham Lincoln was elected president. If you think Kamala's candidacy has been controversial and divisive, then you should read up on Lincoln's. He didn't even appear on the ballot in 9 states, and yet still won the presidency with 40% of the popular vote. And we know that Kamala Harris became the Democratic nominee because Joe Biden unprecedentedly stepped out of the race. And similar to Kamala, Abraham Lincoln was seen as a dangerously progressive ideologue who was going to steal the South states' rights, which means the states' rights to enslave humans. Like, isn't Kamala going to take away your guns and trans your kids? No, she's not. Almost immediately after Lincoln's election, the southern states started seceding, which was illegal, but why would they care? They had states' rights. I'm concerned something similar will happen around the 2024 election. Republicans are lawyering up to challenge a Kamala win, and Democrats are lawyering up to defend it. And wouldn't you know that pandemics plagued the United States both in the 1850s and in the 2020s? We all know the COVID pandemic wreaked havoc across the world and shaped our culture in both constructive and destructive ways. But cholera did much the same thing in the 1840s and 50s throughout the entire world. You may know that a Saturn-Pluto conjunction kicked off the COVID pandemic in 2020, and a similar Saturn-Pluto conjunction in 1851 that continued into 1852 brought the height of the cholera pandemic in the United States. Cholera spread from Europe to the United States, presumably through Irish immigrant ships coming from England. Between 1832 and 1849, cholera had taken the lives of over 150,000 Americans. Now that's a far cry from the 1.1 million we lost to COVID. However, the impact of this pandemic was absolutely devastating. And an outbreak in Chicago in 1854 killed 5.5% of their population. In fact, 1854 was known as the year of cholera in the United States. And just like with COVID, conspiracy theories were a global phenomenon. One common belief that we often hear now is that the upper classes had deliberately released the disease in order to cull the population of the lower classes. So essentially population control. I mean, doesn't that sound like Alex Jones? All you have to do is swing a dead cat on the internet and seal,
"It's population control, folks. It's admitted, folks. I've got the documents."
And then there was this whole nonsense that 5G technology was going to activate some little sort of things in the vaccine that would end up killing all of us who got it. And guess what? That didn't happen. Now you're probably thinking, please, Saturn girl, stop this madness. No more history. Just tell us, will there be a second civil war? Well, in typical Gemini fashion, I have to answer back. It depends on what you mean by civil war. We live in much different conditions than Americans did in the 1860s. Back then, conventional warfare was where you got groups of organized soldiers and lined them up, and they all took their guns and it was the gentlemanly way to fight, you see. However, the American Civil War was like a transition into modern warfare. In fact, carnage like that wouldn't be seen again until the First World War. Those who expected a conventional war in the 1860s were horrified by what ensued. There was chaos and carnage. Bodies and limbs piled up into heaps like garbage. Trenches and foxholes. Machine guns. And new weapons technologies that would tear through human flesh like hot knives through butter. It was an unparalleled catastrophic nightmare. But in this modern age, conventional warfare is fought with drones, long-range missiles or rockets, economic sanctions, and even cyber attacks. Under these conditions, how can a revolt or insurrection possibly hope to succeed when the government has drones? Of course it can't. Pluto was in the stable and earthy sign of Taurus, which is also ruled by Venus. So back then there was still a sense of decorum and etiquette, even in war. But Pluto now is an airy and unstable Aquarius. And as a Saturn-ruled sign, all that matters is domination. But it's also more of a diffuse type of sign, which seems to indicate more localized violence with less centralized leadership. So a civil war like we had in the 1860s is no longer possible. But what does seem likely is localized, widespread, and unorganized political violence, especially under the scenario of a Kamala win. I made a whole separate video about the 2024 election itself, of course before Biden stepped down. But my predictions in it are pretty prescient, so you better pay attention. It should be clear now to anyone with half a brain that a Donald John Trump win would usher in a Christian fascist dictatorship, similar to the Nazi regime of the 1930s and 40s in Germany. However, with less centralized leadership. But if Kamala wins, it looks like a scenario at least comparable to that in 1860 when Lincoln won. And by that I mean Republicans in red states will probably refuse to acknowledge and certify the election results. I'm certain there will be lawsuits regardless of the outcome. But the danger is that the super conservative Supreme Court could decide the election, like when George W. Bush was fraudulently elected in 2000. If state and local election boards refuse to certify election results, we could have a constitutional crisis on our hands. And the implications are not fun. In the 1850s, the political aspirations of the North and South became irreconcilable, and we're reaching a similar point now between red states and blue states. But it's not as cut and dry as it was back then. Many urban centers in red states are decidedly blue, and have large and diverse populations of minorities and progressives. On the one hand, I predict that a Donald John Trump victory would embolden and encourage local right-wing hate groups to terrorize minority communities with violence. On the other hand, I predict that a Kamala victory would result in much the same thing, except with the added constitutional crisis and election denial on our hands. Either way, I predict widespread, unorganized political violence, especially at the local level. A former FBI informant named Joe Moore recently released a book called White Robes and Broken Badges. It was a memoir of his infiltration of the Ku Klux Klan and other right-wing hate groups. In an interview, Moore was quoted as saying, "Nothing I witnessed in any of them scares me as much as what we're facing at home now. Should we be afraid?" With the 2024 election looming and democracy itself on the ballot, the answer is yes. We should be very afraid. But as I've pointed out throughout this video, the astrology seems to support his assertion. And I have to admit, I'm afraid too. But you see, these sort of conflicts couldn't happen unless there was sufficient force mounting for change under the surface. Yes, trans and gay people exist, and immigrants are inextricable from our society. In fact, they're the backbone and the foundation of our country. And women have fought hard for their reproductive rights. Religiosity is even in decline. And guess what? You don't get to abuse minorities with impunity anymore. But on top of all that is economic freedom. The freedom to not have to claw your way through life, to struggle to make it through each day, and to worry about what you have to sacrifice next in order to make ends meet. Kamala has been talking about a variety of policies that would substantively improve the material conditions of the working class. For example, price controls on necessities like food and rent. And this makes corporate interests uncomfortable. You see, the definition of right wing is that social norms and hierarchies are intrinsic to humanity and must be preserved and protected at all cost. While the definition of left wing is that social norms and hierarchies are not inherent to humanity and must be challenged if society is to progress and become more inclusive. In other words, change. And it should be abundantly clear that the right wing hates change. When I was a baby occultist, one of my mentors even said that the opposite of war isn't peace. It's change. When society is not allowed to progress, when progressive forces are in conflict with reactionary and regressive ones, war inevitably ensues. The slogan, "Make America Great Again," could have just as easily come from the Confederacy in the 1860s. The South fought to keep the status quo, which was slavery. They not only want to take us back to the barbarism of the Gilded Age, they want to take us all the way back to the Middle Ages, when people lived in fear of the Inquisition. And they want to be the Inquisition, to police what you do in your bedroom, to tell you what to think, and even tell you who you are. To be fair, Democrats have not given us a lot to be hopeful about. Over and over again, they've foolishly pivoted to the right, as if capitulating to Republicans will somehow make them win. History has shown that it doesn't. Kamala has moved to the right on immigration, She's abandoned Medicare for all, which is one of the most popular policies among all Americans, backed off capital gains tax increases, and she hasn't fully condemned the genocide in Gaza, which most Americans want to end. By contrast, Senator Bernie Sanders has had the same basic platform for decades and hasn't capitulated to the right. And guess what? He's the fourth most popular politician in the United States. So you see, trying to be all things to all people isn't a winning strategy. During the Bill Clinton administration of the 1990s, the Democratic Party basically abandoned labor unions, one of their primary constituencies, in favor of financial interest and the big tech industry. Luckily, it seems like the Democrats have become aware of this issue, evidenced by their current pandering to unions like the United Auto Workers, or UAW, or the Service Employees International Union, or SEIU. I think the empowerment of labor unions is indicative of Pluto in Aquarius. Pluto, of course, just recently moved retrograde back into Capricorn, which signals that the legitimacy of established institutions and power relations is crumbling. In fact, Pluto will still be in Capricorn on Election Day, which means that the 2024 election itself is facilitating and accelerating this process. Pluto will enter Aquarius again in mid-November, and this usually means a showdown between entrenched power relations and more egalitarian movements who are fighting to dismantle them. So please, don't despair. There is hope. Every time that Uranus has left Gemini for Cancer in American history, a period of prosperity and progress has unfolded in the aftermath. Abraham Lincoln was president during the first Uranus return of the U.S., and Franklin Delano Roosevelt was president during the second. These two men are considered the greatest presidents in American history. Whoever the next president is will preside over a similar turning point in human history. Yeah, I'm super partisan, but the astrology alone is telling us that Kamala could be one of the great leaders in American history. However, Pluto in Aquarius teaches us that great leaders don't make history. People do. Masses of people, like you and me. Now, you may know that Jefferson Davis was elected the President of the Confederacy in 1861. And both he and Donald John Trump see themselves as freedom fighters, trying to preserve the spirit of the American Revolution by taking the country back to an imagined golden age where their own personal values prevailed. And both of them are Geminis. But that's a fool's errand. The desire to take us back to the past is just a death wish. They'd rather burn the whole thing down than have it change. And that's the drive behind fascism. As FDR famously said, fascism happens when democracy doesn't deliver on its promises. So, to save democracy, our leadership must deliver. I want chicken, I want liver. Kamala Harris, please deliver. So don't be like Donald John Trump, or Jefferson Davis, or Adolf Hitler. They were chasing shattered memories. Be more like Marty McFly and Doc Brown.
Marty, we have to go back to the future.
Why does Doc Brown sound like Bernie Sanders to me? I hope you've learned something from this video and aren't just depressed after it, like I know I was while I did a lot of this research. Rather, I hope you take away the central lesson that each one of these events and every one of these transits are forcing us to learn that life, liberty, and democracy are keynotes of the human spirit. And they are always, always worth fighting for. Thank you for watching. Like this video and subscribe to my channel. Please also consider tipping me. You can give through Super Thanks below or use my PayPal link in the description. It helps me keep making such wonderful content. And remember, I do the best readings. It's science. You can book through my website, saturngirl.org, or contact me directly. All my info is below in the description. And remember, I love you. You're beautiful. and have a wonderful whatever it is you're having.